Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Morton. My pronouns are she, her. I am the Director of Artist and Studio Programs here at Baltimore Clayworks, and we are thrilled that you all have joined us. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual artist talk given today by Wei Yin Chen. Wei Yin's ceramic practice centers on the hollow eyes of her clay figurines and the viewing relationships constructed through their gazes. By arranging linear sight lines, she guides the viewer into a mode of looking that hovers between participation and exclusion. As a medium that shifts narrative perspectives, the figurines mirror the artist's inner states of escape and vulnerability. Their empty eyes not only respond to her sculptural training and considerations of ocular form, but also translate the viewpoint of the weak under conditions of power and balance. Motifs of girls and tears often transform, showing weakness into an act of resistance, while the cute cartoon-like visual language reveals a tragedy concealed beneath a sweet appearance. The technique of inflated modeling heightens emotional tension, allowing cuteness to become a vessel for social alienation and rebellious energy. In addition, the work actively explores cross-dimensional relationships between the two and three-dimensional. Through the improvisational and fractured qualities of imagery, it reconsiders the intertwined possibilities of image and space. For more information about our artist talks, please visit our virtual library at baltimoreclayworks.org. And I will now turn it over to Wei Yin.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wei Chen. I was born and raised in Taiwan. I received my BFA in Fine Arts from National Taiwan Normal University in 2022 and my MFA in Applied Arts from Tainan National University of the Arts in 2025. Before I turned to ceramics, I spent many years working primarily as a painter. While I was in college, I began taking classes in figure sculpture and mold making outside the university. That was my first introduction to three-dimensional making. Although sculpture, mold making, and ceramics are very different processes, the ceramic courses I took in college gave me a solid foundation before graduate school. More importantly, graduate school gave me the time to slow down, rethink my practice, and gradually find a way of making that felt right to me. My early work grew out of my own experience of living with social labels. I began making soft organic forms that move between abstraction and representation. Sometimes you could recognize hints of a creature, but they never became fully defined. At the time, I wasn't consciously referencing any particular artist or visual source. I was simply interested in that in-between moment when the form is still changing and a living creature hasn't quite taken shape yet. When I first started working with clay, I wasn't very comfortable with coil building. Instead, I built my sculptures using small circular pieces of clay. Looking back, I think that process trained my hands to become much more sensitive to subtle change in form. As I became more confident, I gradually combined this method with coil building, which led to fuller, softer forms. From the beginning, my work has centered on soft organic forms that shift between abstraction and representation. Room was probably the first piece that fully captured the world I had been imagining. The installation resembles clothing and everyday objects scattered across furniture in a home. I used detachable toy parts as a way of thinking about the different roles we take on in society. Bringing these abstract ceramic forms together with realistic wooden furniture, create a space that exists somewhere between reality and the surreal. During graduate school, I had many opportunities to see work and exchange ideas with other artists. In addition to conversation with visiting artists, we often went on field trips and exchange programs in different places, including the United States, China, South Korea, and Japan. Seeing such a wide range of work and listening to artists talk about their practice slowly pushed me to think more seriously about my own visual language. Around that time, I also started introducing more recognizable imagery into my work. A bicycle, a plant, or even everyday objects, things that normally don't have life, would somehow begin to feel like they had bodies. They started to carry movement, almost as if they were following their own logic. Looking back, that was when I began moving closer to character-based forms. My sculptures started to develop facial features, and slowly they began to show emotion as well. I realized that I had always been drawn to characters even before I had a language to explain why. At that point, I started wondering what characters actually meant to me. When I was working on this work, I also started paying attention to my drawings again, not just the image themselves, but the way I drew, my brush strokes, the loose composition on the page, and even the physical feeling of drawing at that moment. Over time, those observations became another thread in my work. After I shifted more seriously into sculpture, I naturally spent less time drawing. But at the same time, I noticed I didn't enjoy making drawings that only functioned as a plan for ceramic construction. When drawings were reduced to instructions, they lost the kind of freedom that I needed. Even so, I never really left drawing behind. I still made spontaneous sketches of whatever came to mind. Sometimes they came from daily life, from emotions that turn into characters, and sometimes from simple cartoon symbols that carried a kind of personal meaning for me. Eventually, I brought that way of drawing directly into my ceramic work. At first, I simply drew on the surface of my ceramic figures, letting the drawings sit directly on the form instead of treating them as a separate sketches. In 2024, I participated in a residency at the University of Arkansas. During one of our class presentations, we were asked to introduce ourselves through the things we were naturally drawn to: music, television, photographs, and other materials that shape our daily lives. It became a kind of personal archive of interest. And through that process, I started to see my work from a slightly different angle. I realized that I had always been drawn to early cartoons and to nostalgic objects. At that point, I began paying more attention to how these visual elements were constructed, rather than just what they represented. This led me to develop a series of works that combine cartoon imagery with references from subcultures, focusing on everyday experience of being with other people. The residency became a turning point in my practice. This was the first time I began to consciously bring early American cartoon into my work and to connect it with the sculptural vocabulary I had already developing. Among all these influences, Fleischer Studios had the strongest impact on me. What I'm most interested in is the way their forms seem completely free. They can stretch, collapse, or transform into almost anything. Yet they still follow a very clear internal logic. In their animations, reality and imagination exist at the same time without conflict. What also struck me is how they use humor and exaggeration. Their characters are often cute, even absurdly indestructible, but at the same time, they carry something darker underneath. That combination of humor, distortion, and emotional weight stayed with me. It made me realize that this kind of language could also become a way for me to talk about my own experiences. During my time in Arkansas, I also started making more wall-mounted ceramic works. At first, they were closer to the idea of signage, almost like flat image in space. Over time, they gradually shift into something closer to relief sculpture. Even now, I'm still interested in this in-between state between image and object, sculpture and drawing. I often think about how a work can change depending on the way it is viewed and how it might carry both immediacy and material presence at the same time. After returning to Taiwan, I began to more clearly organize the relationship between my ceramic figures and narrative-based installation. This process eventually became part of both my thesis show and my paper. One of the key ideas I explored was the use of hollow eyes in my ceramic figures. For me, this absence of gaze created a kind of openness. It allowed the figures to hold multiple interpretations rather than fixing them into a single emotional reading. I became interested in how gesture alone could begin to generate narrative. The show was structured through 6 different scenes. Each space carried a different situation or emotional condition. Trophy presented an unnamed hunter. Pin cushion centered on a girl figure, and a comedy for the crowd explored performance and observation. Another group of figures appeared as if they had been struck or interrupted by force. The remaining scenes included the devil, Medusa, One Piece, and the price of love. Rather than telling a single linear story, these works were arranged as fragments. Each scene held its own tension, but together they create a shifting narrative about conflict, injury, and emotional exposure. I was interested in leaving enough space for viewers to complete the story through their own way of looking. Before coming to Baltimore Clayworks, I had just finished my solo show in Taiwan. Something went wrong. The title comes from a childhood game in Taiwan called 大风吹, or The Big Wind Blows, where players must quickly change seats whenever the rules shift. In this exhibition, I was thinking about what it feels like to enter a new environment with an uncertain sense of identity. At the same time, I was trying to balance work and life, and I kept going through repeated shifts and adjustment. It felt like I was constantly trying to hold things together while everything around me was changing. Based on these experiences of trying to manage a kind of ongoing chaos, I used scatter flyers to connect the whole exhibition. The flyers contained absurd and almost useless message, which became a way to talk about unrealistic promise and fragile idea. The scatter installation also became a response to a wind that doesn't really exist, something imagined but still strongly felt. Through this body of work, I began to think more about humor as a way of looking at experience. Humor became a way for me to approach reality more directly. By wrapping difficult or uncomfortable feelings inside cartoon imagery and jokes, I could talk about things that might otherwise feel too heavy to say. For me, cartoons are not just a visual style, they are a way of thinking. They allow contradiction to exist between seriousness and absurdity, reality and imagination. This way of thinking continues into my current residency at Baltimore Clayworks. Recently, because of changes in my family, I have been thinking more about memory, connection, and death. These thoughts also led me back to the print graphics I remember from industrial objects in my childhood. I find myself drawn to them in a similar way as early cartoons. I realized that many of these objects brought together visual influences from different places and different periods. Some remind me of Japanese children illustrations, while others echo European decorative imagery. Although these images came from very different cultural backgrounds, they somehow became part of the visual environment I grew up with in Taiwan. I'm still trying to understand why they continue to attract me. Part of it is certainly nostalgia. Sometimes that feeling comes from old music or from objects that I've only encountered indirectly through stories from older generations or by watching them slowly disappear from everyday life. Because of that distance, I often imagine a past that I never actually experienced, a past that feels vivid, expansive, and full of possibilities. At the same time, I know that this is only one way of imagining the past, and that those periods were far more complex than my nostalgia allows. Working here has also given me the opportunity to experiment with new materials and new ways of making. As I continue this residency, I hope to further explore how these memories and visual references can be translated into form, while continuing to move between character, image, and sculpture. I look forward to share the results of this residency with all of you. Thank you.